"You better back away from that fence right now or I'm calling the police." That's the first thing I heard stepping onto the land my family had owned for generations. No greeting, no curiosity, just a woman in a fluorescent yellow vest and aviator sunglasses barking orders at me like she owned the place. I was still holding the keys to the front gate, my name clearly marked on the deed stuffed in my pocket, and yet somehow I was the one being accused of trespassing. I blinked, half laughing, thinking maybe she was confused. But no, this woman wasn't confused. She was fully committed to the delusion that this was her always community space, and I was the intruder. 10 minutes later, I found myself explaining to two very real officers why I was standing in front of my own barn, while Karen kept dramatically insisting I had jumped the gate to loot the property. I told the officer calmly, "Just scan the QR code on my ID. It links directly to the county registry." When he did, the mood shifted fast. The officer turned to Karen with a look I'll never forget and said, "Ma'am, this man owns the land. We need to talk about this deed you handed me." Karen's jaw unhinged like a cartoon character, and I could swear she started backing up like she'd just been caught trying to rob a bank with a crayon drawing of money. 3 days earlier, I had been sipping coffee at a train station in Frankfurt, finalizing my return to the States. I had spent the last 3 years working in Europe on environmental projects, helping to revitalize post-agricultural land. With my work wrapping up, it felt like the perfect time to come home to Texas, to the Martinez family farm. It had been in our name since 1884. My parents had passed years ago, and though I'd rented parts of the land out to nearby farmers, the homestead, barn, and surrounding acres were still fully ours, fully mine now. I had every legal document updated, taxes paid, and even a state-certified preservation title because the barn had historical value. So when I pulled up to the entrance, I expected weeds, maybe a few raccoons, not laminated HOA signage zip-tied to every fence post. The first red flag was that the original wooden farm sign was gone. The Martinez family farm sign my great-grandfather carved by hand was replaced with one that read Pleasant Grove Ehowo Community Garden, members only. I sat in my truck for a moment confused. Maybe the tenants had made a temporary agreement with the HOA for gardening access. But the more I looked around, the more wrong it felt. The gate had a padlock that wasn't mine. There were solar lights lining the gravel drive. Someone had put up lawn gnomes near the barn. And that's when I noticed her. Karen. She was patrolling like a security guard, clipboard in hand, sunglasses pushed to the tip of her nose. She marched over like she was doing me a favor, asking in the most condescending tone, "Can I help you, sir?" I told her, trying to keep it casual, that I was the owner, just getting a look around. That's when her demeanor changed. "This is private HOA property. You need to leave immediately. Trespassing is a criminal offense," she snapped. I blinked, genuinely unsure if she was joking. I told her again that I owned the farm. She laughed. "Oh, we've had plenty of crazies try that scam before. You people see a nice open space and think you can just walk in and claim it. Not happening today." She pulled out her phone and started filming me. "This is for evidence," she said smugly, as if I was seconds away from stealing the barn and strapping it to my truck. Then she called the police. I stayed exactly where I was, leaning on the fence, arms crossed, waiting. When the police showed up, I greeted them politely. One of them, Officer Rodriguez, seemed receptive. The other, Officer Williams, clearly knew Karen. She whispered something to him and pointed at me. He walked over and asked for ID, which I handed over along with my state-issued title card. But then Karen, still filming, produced a thick folder of paperwork. "Here's our HOA deed showing community claim to this land. This man is trespassing. He's been aggressive." I didn't even react. I just pointed to the QR code on my ID. Officer Rodriguez scanned it with his phone. Less than 30 seconds later, his eyebrows shot up. "Ma'am, this registry shows Mr. Martinez as the sole legal owner of this parcel. This deed you provided doesn't match the registry at all." Karen's face lost all color. "That must be an error," she stammered. "We annexed this area years ago. It's always been part of Pleasant Grove, OA. No, ma'am, it hasn't, Officer Rodriguez replied, handing her back the folder. It appears this is your mistake, and I suggest you stop interfering with private property. Karen tried to argue, but now the attention was on her. Williams took a few steps away, clearly uncomfortable with how this was turning out. After the cops left and Karen stormed off, muttering something about her attorney, I walked the land. There were raised garden beds, a gazebo in the middle of the field, and even a coop with chickens. My barn had a new lock. My porch had been power washed and painted some god-awful shade of coral. And someone had added a hammock between two pecan trees. The nerve. I wasn't sure how long this had been going on, but I knew one thing. Karen wasn't just squatting. She was orchestrating something bigger. This wasn't a one-off confusion. It was a hostile takeover attempt, and she picked the wrong trespasser. That night, I reviewed the documents I'd brought home from Europe, scanned copies of everything I'd need to press charges if necessary. I also called a property lawyer friend, told him everything, and by the time I went to bed, we had a plan. But before I could take action, I needed proof of what this FOA had been doing on my land. And if Karen wanted to play hardball, I was ready to bring a legal bulldozer. The next morning, I bought new trail cameras and installed them all over the property. If they were holding secret meetings, I'd catch them. If someone tried to plant more community property signs, I'd get it on tape. But most importantly, I was done being polite. This was war now, not over grass or fences, but over a legacy. And legacy is something you don't let HOA Karens rewrite with their clipboards and delusions of grandeur. I woke up the next morning to the sound of roosters crowing. Not mine, by the way. Karen's precious HOA community garden had apparently added chickens to the mix, and they had taken residence in a freshly built coop right behind my barn. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and saw a neighbor walking their dog along the perimeter fence like it was some public park. The absurdity hadn't worn off overnight. If anything, the weight of how far this FOA had gone made it even more ridiculous. I wasn't just dealing with a woman mistaking property lines. No, this was a calculated effort to seize, convert, and profit from land that didn't belong to her or anyone else in that subdivision. And she'd gotten pretty far with it too. After finishing my coffee, I headed straight to the county recorder's office. I needed to know if Karen had actually filed anything legitimate. Maybe she pulled off some obscure zoning loophole or annexation clause while I was overseas. I wasn't expecting much, but what I found shocked even me. The clerk behind the desk gave me a puzzled look when I asked if any HOA annexations had been filed for parcel 42912B, the Martinez family farm. She typed for a moment, then frowned. "We've got a community overlay claim here, filed 9 months ago by the Pleasant Grove OA," she said slowly. "But this claim isn't complete. It doesn't have legal consent from the parcel owner, which is you." I asked her to print everything. I wanted the full packet of Karen's fantasy paperwork. As soon as I got it in my hands, the puzzle pieces snapped into place. She had filed a community development overlay, claiming the land had been abandoned and that the HOA had assumed responsibility to beautify and protect it. But it was missing key signatures, including mine. The document even had a public endorsement section filled with scrawled names from a neighborhood survey that looked more like a block party sign-in sheet than a legal endorsement. I laughed under my breath as I read it. These people had truly signed their names under approval to adopt the land for communal benefit, like they were voting for a new neighborhood swing set. The next part of the day was spent documenting everything. I scanned the papers, organized them with my certified deed copies, and drafted a formal cease and desist letter with my lawyer's help. The notice was straightforward. The OOA had no claim to the property, no legal standing, and no authority to manage, modify, or fine me for anything. I also added a demand that all unauthorized structures, livestock, and signage be removed within 10 business days. I printed out a few copies, laminated them, and drove straight to the farm. When I got there, Karen was in the middle of giving a garden tour to a small group of yoga moms and retired couples. They were sipping green smoothies while Karen waved her arms around proudly, pointing out each vegetable patch like she had plowed herself. I parked just outside the gate and walked right through this time, carrying a small folder and a GoPro clipped to my shirt. The second she saw me, her face twisted like she'd eaten a lemon. "You need to leave immediately," she barked. "I've already warned you about harassment. This is HOA protected property." I smiled, pulling the laminated notice from the folder. "Actually, this is a formal cease and desist letter. You and your HOA have zero legal claim to this land. Here's the documentation to prove it." She didn't even read it. She snatched the paper, looked it over for half a second, and crumpled it like I'd handed her a grocery flyer. "This is a scare tactic," she said loudly, turning to the tour group. "This man is not the owner. He's trying to intimidate us." I reached into the folder again and handed her a certified copy of my deed. "You can crumple this one too, but it won't change the fact that I'm the legal owner of this land, and your little garden party is about to become a legal liability." She looked ready to explode. "We'll see what the HOA legal committee says," she snapped before storming off toward the barn. I watched her go, noting the fresh padlock on the barn doors. One I didn't install. While the group awkwardly dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves, I started removing her absurd signs. I yanked the HOA community use zone banner off the fence and tossed it in my truck. I also took pictures of every unauthorized structure: the gazebo, the chicken coop, the yoga mat station near the oak tree. I wasn't about to touch them yet. My lawyer warned me not to, so instead, I documented everything in detail. That night, the retaliation began. As if on cue, I found 3 envelopes stuffed in my mailbox, fake HOA fines. One charged me $1,200 for unauthorized interference with HOA operations. Another said I owed $700 for property defacement, and the third warned of potential HOA litigation for community endangerment. I actually laughed when I read them. Not a single one was signed by a real attorney, nor did they reference a legitimate statute. The funniest part: one of the letters had a typo that read, "Failure to pay may result in immediate evaporative measures," which I assume meant eviction, unless Karen had found a way to vaporize me off the land. Still, the joke wore off quickly. My lawyer told me we needed to take action soon before Karen got more creative. He recommended we start by gathering undeniable evidence of their intrusion and misrepresentation. That's when I decided to install motion-triggered cameras. I spent the next day quietly setting up trail cams throughout the property, inside trees, behind fence posts, even in the weather vane atop the barn. If Karen or her minions tried to build more, host another event, or sneak in under cover of night, I'd catch them. 2 days later, the cameras delivered. I got a ping on my phone around 9:30 p.m. I opened the app and watched as Karen and 2 other HOA board members entered the barn with flashlights. They laid out folders and diagrams on my father's old workbench, my bench, and discussed how to stage a reclaimed land ceremony that weekend. One of them, a guy with a clipboard and a ponytail, said, "We'll hold the ribbon cutting here, then get Channel 7 to cover it. If we go public fast enough, it won't matter if he owns it. The court of public opinion is what counts." Karen nodded, saying, "We just need to make it look like it's always been ours. Once it's on TV, he's the trespasser." I paused the footage, staring at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just lying to neighbors. They were coordinating a full-blown media manipulation campaign. And that's when it clicked. If they wanted to play public games, I'd go public too, because I had something stronger than petty fines and a clipboard. I had the truth, the title, and the receipts. I sat on my porch the next morning with the camera footage playing over and over on my tablet. Karen's voice was sharp, commanding, and eerily confident. She spoke like someone who believed they were untouchable, someone who thought public perception was more powerful in fact. Once it's on TV, he's the trespasser. That line echoed in my head like a bad psalm stuck on repeat. It was one thing to illegally occupy my land. It was another to weaponize the media against me. I knew I had to move quickly before she dragged this circus even further into fantasy. So I made a call to someone who knew exactly how to handle a situation like this, an old classmate of mine who now worked as an investigative reporter for the local news. Her name was Emily. We hadn't talked since college, but when I sent her the footage and explained the backstory, she called me within 10 minutes. Her voice crackled with energy as she said, "This is gold. HOA overreach, fake paperwork, a legacy farm at risk. Viewers are going to eat this up." I didn't want fame or attention, just justice. But if Karen wanted to play the public game, I'd let the world see her for who she really was. Emily scheduled a visit for the next morning and brought her camera crew. I walked them through the property, showed them the fake HOA signs, the unauthorized modifications, and finally, the damning video footage of the late-night barn meeting. Emily asked me to sit for an interview right by the old oak tree that had stood on our farm for over 100 years. She knew the power of a good visual. By the time the news segment aired that evening, the reaction was instant. Emails poured in. Neighbors, former HOA members, even strangers from across the county reached out in disbelief. Comments flooded the news station's page. Some called Karen a power-hungry yard dictator. Others offered to volunteer if I needed help removing the HOA junk off my land. But what I didn't expect was the internal revolt that began brewing inside the HOA itself. It started as a whisper, a few board members distancing themselves from Karen's actions. But by the next day, screenshots of their group chat leaked on a local forum. The texts were brutal. One message read, "Karen is going to take us all down with her. We were just following her lead." Another said, "She lied to us. She said the farm was already donated. I feel sick." And then came the surprise visit. A silver truck pulled into my driveway around noon. Out stepped a tall, weathered man with a folder in hand and a faded cap that read 1973 Land Development Association. He introduced himself as Howard Thompson, the original developer of the Pleasant Grove neighborhood. He'd seen the news piece and wanted to set the record straight. We sat at the porch table, and he opened the folder to reveal the original zoning map. "I designed this community back in the early 80s, he said, tapping the yellowed paper with a thick finger. "And I can tell you right now, this farm was never part of the HOA jurisdiction. Never. I kept it separate on purpose because of its heritage status. That woman has no claim, and this map proves it." I felt like I'd been handed a smoking gun. Howard agreed to testify if it came to court. Not only did he have maps, but he also had memos and correspondence with the city zoning office from back when the neighborhood was first approved. I scanned every document, organized them neatly, and sent digital copies to my lawyer that same afternoon. We updated our legal filing. The suit was no longer just about trespassing and fraudulent claims. It now included defamation, misrepresentation, and attempted land seizure. But while the legal side advanced, I still had to deal with Karen's day-to-day antics. Despite the growing pressure, Karen doubled down. I spotted new flyers taped to mailboxes around the neighborhood, warning residents not to fall for media manipulation and claiming I was trying to turn the land into a commercial factory. She even posted a fake blueprint online showing a fictional rendering of a gas station and parking lot labeled "Coming soon to your backyard." It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so reckless. Neighbors started asking questions. Some looked angry. A few drove by my gate slowly, staring like I was some villain threatening their gardens. That's when I knew I had to act again. Instead of hiding, I hosted a meet and greet on the property. I put up a sign inviting neighbors to come by for coffee and conversation. Emily returned with her crew to cover it, and I made sure to lay everything out in the open. Photos, deeds, maps, even video clips on loop at a small table with a TV. People trickled in slowly, cautiously. But once they saw the evidence, the mood changed. One couple told me they paid $600 last year to join the community farm and were told it was donated land. Another neighbor brought her kid and said Karen had banned him from using the swing near the barn because he didn't pay his harvest dues. I didn't even know what that meant, but it sounded like nonsense Karen would invent just to hold power. Toward the end of the event, Karen showed up. She wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members flanked her, looking visibly uncomfortable. She marched straight up to me, hands shaking with papers in her grip, and tried to serve me with what she called a community violation summons. I didn't take the papers. I simply pointed to the crowd, to the TV screen showing the barn meeting footage, and then to developer Howard Thompson, who was now sitting under the tree sipping lemonade like he was watching theater. Karen, I said evenly, you're standing on someone else's land, in front of dozens of witnesses, after submitting false documents and lying to this entire community. If you hand me that paper, I'll consider it one more count of harassment to add to the suit. Your call. She stood frozen, lips twitching. One of the board members muttered something and walked away. The other followed. Karen looked around at the silent crowd, at the news camera still rolling, and for the first time, she seemed unsure. Without another word, she turned and left, the paper still clutched in her hand. As the sun set behind the barn that evening, casting long orange shadows across the field, I felt something shift. The farm was still tangled in legal mess, but momentum had changed. The story was out. The lies were unraveling. And Karen, so loud, so arrogant, was beginning to lose the one thing she thrived on: control. Now all I had to do was finish what I started and make sure this land, my land, was finally respected the way it always should have been. The tension around the farm had started to take on a strange new flavor. One part legal war zone, one part public spectacle. Word had spread far beyond the neighborhood now. Local newspapers picked up the story. One even ran a headline that read, HOA attempts to annex historic family farm, gets schooled by legal owner. I had to admit, it had a certain ring to it. But even as public support tilted more and more in my favor, Karen wasn't done. She had gone quiet for a couple of days, which I should have known was the calm before another ridiculous storm, because what she did next pushed everything to a whole new level of audacity. On a gray Tuesday morning, I got a call from my lawyer just before I walked out to check the trail cams. He sounded incredulous. You're not going to believe this, he said. Karen filed an emergency injunction this morning in county court. She's claiming the farm is in legal limbo and should be held in trust as public property until ownership is clarified. I nearly dropped my phone. The woman who had forged documents, lied to police, and staged unauthorized events on my land was now trying to get a judge to temporarily seize it under the pretense of protecting the public interest. I didn't wait. I drove straight to the courthouse. My lawyer met me outside and handed me the paperwork. It was laughable, sloppily typed, full of vague language and emotional appeals. It didn't cite a single real legal statute. It even referred to me as a transient individual of unknown employment background. I had to laugh at that. Apparently, spending 3 years revitalizing agricultural zones across Europe made me a drifter in Karen's mind. The judge took one look at the filing, rolled his eyes, and scheduled an immediate hearing for that afternoon. When we entered the courtroom, Karen was already seated with her lawyer, a slick-looking guy in a wrinkled suit who clearly hadn't read the full case. The judge, a stern woman with no time for theatrics, asked for a summary. Karen's lawyer stood and began droning on about how the land had been neglected and how the community had bonded over the transformation of the farm into a peaceful garden. He claimed it would cause emotional harm to the residents if the land was ripped away. Then it was my turn. My lawyer calmly handed over the certified deed, the zoning maps, the footage of Karen and her board members plotting in my barn, and an affidavit from Howard Thompson, the original developer. As the judge reviewed the stack of documents, I saw Karen fidgeting in her seat, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might fold in on herself. After several tense minutes, the judge looked up and said the words I had hoped for but wasn't entirely sure I'd hear. This injunction is denied. This man is the legal owner. Any continued interference by the HOA or its representatives will be considered harassment and trespassing. You may want to consider legal counsel beyond today, ma'am, because I strongly suspect this is not over. Karen tried to speak, but her lawyer put a hand on her arm and shook his head. She looked like she just swallowed a nail. With the court behind me, I knew the HOA board was going to start eating itself alive. And I wasn't wrong. By the next day, 2 more members had resigned publicly. They released a joint statement that read, in part, "We were misled. We regret our involvement and stand by the rightful property owner." The remaining members scheduled an emergency vote to remove Karen from the presidency, and when she got wind of it, She went into full meltdown mode. I got a call from a neighbor who witnessed Karen pacing around the community center, yelling into her phone, accusing everyone of betrayal and sabotage. She'd gone from smug commander of the HOA to paranoid queen with no kingdom. I didn't need to lift a finger at that point. The residents were turning on her. One family sent me a box of produce they had harvested from the community garden, along with a note that said, "We had no idea. We're so sorry. Thank you for protecting this land." Another neighbor offered to help remove the structures if I needed labor, but I still held off. My lawyer said not to touch anything until the countersuit was filed. He was preparing a civil case that would officially list damages, including legal fees, defamation, and emotional distress. I didn't need to swing a hammer to get justice. I just needed to follow through calmly and methodically. Still, that didn't stop Karen from making one last desperate attempt to save face. She showed up at the farm again, but this time she brought 2 hired private security officers in matching polos with a fake HOA badge printed on the chest. She marched up to my front gate, stood behind them like some kind of suburban mob boss, and loudly declared that they were here to inspect and secure the premises. I didn't even bother arguing. I just pulled out my phone, hit the emergency line, and calmly told the dispatcher that trespassers were attempting to forcibly enter private property with fake credentials. Police arrived within minutes. Karen tried to twist the story again, but when the officers asked for her documentation, she handed them the same laughable forged papers. They weren't amused. One of the officers, the same Officer Rodriguez from day one, sighed and turned to her. "Man, you've been warned. This is criminal trespassing now." She was given a final citation and a notice that further attempts to step foot on my property without permission would result in arrest. She didn't even protest this time. She just stood there, silent, her fake security slowly backing away like they just realized they were extras in the wrong movie. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the barn, casting a warm glow across the fields, I sat with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. The gates were locked. By me. The porch light flickered on automatically. And the land, my land, was quiet again. The garden beds still sat there, awkward and out of place, but they'd be removed soon. The chickens would be returned to someone who could legally house them. The gazebo would be dismantled, and the laughable yoga platform would be gone. Karen had lost her voice in the neighborhood. The woman who once handed out fines for untrimmed grass and improper mailbox decoration now couldn't get anyone to return her calls. She was censured by the HOA, stripped of her title, and pending formal investigation from the city for falsified documents. She had come in swinging, waving fake deeds and spewing entitlement, and left with nothing but a handful of citations and a lawsuit aimed straight at her bank account. But I wasn't done. I had one more step to take, and it would be the most satisfying of all. Not revenge, restoration, because the farm wasn't just about stopping her. It was about honoring the legacy my family left behind, and I was going to bring it back to life on my terms. The following week, everything started falling into place like the final pieces of a puzzle snapping together. The land, which had been tangled in HOA banners, rogue garden beds, and the kind of ridiculous signage only Karen could dream up, was finally mine again in every visible way. The lawsuit was filed. My lawyer was confident. Karen's fraudulent documents were now part of an active investigation by the county clerk's office, and the HOA board had fully collapsed under the weight of her arrogance. They had dissolved all enforcement power temporarily, claiming they needed internal restructuring and community trust rebuilding. But let's be honest, what they really needed was a hard reset, and maybe a therapist or two to unpack why they'd let one woman run them like a dictatorship. As I stood by the barn one morning, the sound of silence was the loudest it had been since I returned. No power drills, no Karen yelling about trespassing violations, no hired security pretending they were in an action movie. Just birds, the wind, and the occasional hum of my trail cams, which were still up and running because I wasn't taking any chances. I had started making a list of all the unauthorized structures I'd be removing, starting with the yoga gazebo, followed by the weird meditation rock circle that someone clearly built from decorative landscaping stones. A neighbor actually messaged me and asked if I'd be keeping the chicken coop. I told him no, but he could have it if he came with a truck. He showed up 30 minutes later, but while the legal process was moving ahead, something unexpected started happening in the neighborhood. People who had once avoided me were now stopping by just to talk. One woman brought me banana bread. Another guy who worked as a handyman offered to help me tear down the HOA signs. One older couple came by just to say they remembered my parents and had always loved the farm's orchard. It was strange how quickly the tide had turned. Karen had built her little empire on control and fear, but the truth had blown through it like a storm. And now, with her gone, the people who had been under her thumb were emerging from the fog like survivors of some weird suburban cult. Then came the news that nobody expected but somehow felt like cosmic justice. Karen had been evicted from her home. Apparently, she had been embezzling HOA funds to cover her legal bills. Her fancy porch furniture, bought with HOA money. Her landscaping, funded by community dues. When the board finally got access to the accounts, they found thousands missing. She was charged with fraud, and her home was seized as part of the restitution process. A photo of her sitting on the curb next to a pile of her things made it to the front page of the local paper. The headline was simple: From President to Defendant, The Fall of Karen. I framed a copy and put it in the barn. In the weeks that followed, I turned my attention back to what mattered, rebuilding the farm, but not just as a private sanctuary. I wanted to restore what it was always meant to be, something that lived between community and heritage. So I reached out to a few local schools and offered to host field trips. I partnered with a local nonprofit to start a real, legally sound community garden on one corner of the land. But this time, there were contracts, waivers, insurance, and most importantly, mutual respect. No power grabs, no fines, just people growing vegetables and watching kids learn where food really comes from. The barn was cleaned out, repainted, and fitted with solar panels. I turned one section into a little museum of sorts, photos of the farm over the generations, tools my grandfather had used, even a map showing how the land had changed since the 1800s. A family friend helped design a sign that stood near the entrance. It read, "The Martinez Family Farm, restored and protected." Underneath that, in smaller print, it said, "Private property. HOA fines will be laughed at." People loved it. Some took selfies with the sign. Others just nodded and smiled as they passed. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during the community's annual fall market. The HOA used to control it, selecting which vendors could sell, how much space they could use, and how much they had to pay. This year, the city allowed it to be hosted on my land, free of charge. No forms, no power trips, just an open space and local people doing what they love. I stood near the orchard, sipping cider, watching kids run through rows of pumpkins, and thought about how quickly things had changed. A year ago, Karen had tried to erase my family's history. Now she was legally barred from stepping within 500 feet of the property. And still, the story wasn't quite done. A neighbor showed me a blog Karen had tried to start from her temporary housing. Titled My Side of the Fence, it was meant to be her tell-all, explaining how she was the real victim and had only wanted to bring order to chaos. The blog had 3 posts, all ranting about lawless landowners and media bias, and then it abruptly stopped, probably because her lawyer realized it was just giving us more material for court. We printed it anyway and submitted it as part of our defamation claim. Eventually, the settlement came. Karen was ordered to pay damages, legal fees, and reimburse every resident she had billed for the fake farm fees. She was broke, publicly disgraced, and no longer a threat to anyone. Meanwhile, the Martinez family farm stood stronger than ever, not just because I won, but because I stayed rooted in truth while she drowned in her delusion. That evening, as the sun lowered and cast golden rays across the freshly restored barn, I sat on the porch with a mug in my hand. I looked out at the land, mine not because of some court order, but because of blood, sweat, and legacy. And in the distance, I could hear laughter from the garden, a far cry from Karen's shouting. The farm didn't just survive her, it grew stronger because of her.